Hi folks, welcome back to the shop. Today I just want to talk about what I think is the best circular saw on the market and also about circular saws in general. Now, to me there's a lot of confusion out there when you go to buy a circular saw, maybe more confusion than just about any power tool because there's so many options out there in terms of making the selection. Even if you pick a certain style of saw, there's all kinds of variations and different levels between each one. Now, what I have here is is probably one of the most common saws that you're familiar with, which is the typical 7¼ inch blade, 24 tooth sidewinder saw. They call this a sidewinder saw because the motor is directly in line, right? The motor's here and you have it directly in line with the blade mount. So as this motor spins up, it spins the blade. It's sort of a direct drive saw. As opposed to like a worm drive saw. So a worm drive saw or worm gear drive saw is going to have a handle in the back that's going to extend, much further back. The drive is here in the back as well, and there's a worm screw that drives the blade, and that one is the other style of saw that's been around for decades, many decades, right? So those I think are historically speaking, are the two most common types of saws. Now, this saw I got in a promotion. It came with a charger and a couple batteries and a couple other tools. So that's really why I bought this on clearance. And at the time, I was kind of looking into saws and was sort of tired of looking into it because there's just so many options out there. Like I said, one of the criticisms of these saws I discovered at that time was that if you're right-handed and you have this saw in your hand, which I'm right-handed, the blade is right mounted, and of course that's great because all the scrap material, the waste material you're cutting falls away from the user. The sawdust, this is your sawdust port here. If I can illustrate that, sawdust port here blows the sawdust away from the user as well, so you don't have that blowing on you. But the drawback is you don't have very much of a line of sight on this blade. If you want to see this blade, you find yourself kind of leaning over the saw and looking here to try to see if it's cutting on the line. Otherwise, you're trying to do all your sighting here, via this notch right here. And I don't know if I can show it or not, but this lower notch, see if I can illustrate it here. This lower notch right here, yeah, right there, that edge, if you can see that, is another sight point. So you have two sight points there, but you'll notice right away that if you're using this saw as a right-handed person, as soon as you put your hand on this handle, it's really blocking your line of sight and trying to see where the blade is coming in contact with the material. So it got me thinking, well, what about a left-hung blade? And that leads me to what I think is the best circular saw on the market for most people. And this is, notice a left-hung blade, and it's the Milwaukee 6½ inch blade circular saw. Same tooth count as the other one, 24 teeth that come with the saw. It's a framing blade. Rougher cut saw or less teeth is good, particularly on these cordless circular saws, because it allows them to cut faster, takes less power, and really helps optimize the saw, I think, for a lot of your cuts. Now, as you see here, of course, you have, as a right-hander, you have direct line of sight of the blade. You can see this blade come in contact with the work as you're cutting through it. It gives you a confidence that you're on target. And if you didn't know this, of course, it's good to have 2 points of sight. Or 2 lines of sight. You can sight the line here and also watch the blade and this groove here as well. The more points in which you sight that line, the more likely your cut's going to be straight. But anyway, this is that left-hung blade that gives you the line of sight. Now, they don't make this saw in a 7¼ inch blade like the other saw I just showed. I think there's one manufacturer out there that does it, somewhat of a rare brand, that has a 7¼ inch left-hung bladed saw. Unless, of course, we're talking about what I think the first saw that was made by Skill, that's a worm drive saw that I mentioned earlier that has the rear handle. Those saws have always been a 7¼ inch blade and with a left-hung blade. I think more popular in the western part of the United States. Now, the drawback, though, with one of those worm drive saws is while you do get the 7¼ inch blade, the saw is bigger, much longer because the handle's back here, the motor and the drive system's back here with a worm gear that's literally driving this motor, and a little oil reservoir back here that you have to maintain, make sure it's not running low. You're supposed to change the oil every so often. So heavier, more maintenance. I think it's a better saw for someone, I think, who's probably, doing a lot of production framing, because when you have that handle further back, it gives you a lot of control, minor subtle movements in controlling that blade and making a really good cut. Whereas subtle movements on this saw, they move the blade quite a bit. So I think there's that skill draft saw definitely has its place, and you can do a lot of downward cuts sort of free-handed with that saw. And just use gravity to pull the saw down. So the classic worm drive or skill saw is a great tool, but it is bigger, heavier. You have the oil reservoir to deal with, and that's why I decided to go with this saw, due to the fact it's lighter weight. Now, one of the biggest reasons I hesitated to buy this saw and did not get it originally was because it was my understanding that it couldn't cut through at a 45-degree angle 2x material. So you'll notice here, if you were to take this shoe and adjust it to a 45-degree angle right here, we just go right down here to about 45 degrees, right? Angle this blade of the saw, that when you're cutting through the material, that it couldn't make it all the way through any kind of 2x material. So take an example here. I have a piece of 2x4 here. We look at this 2x4, you can see that it is about, if I can get that to focus, it's about 1.5 inches, just shy of 1.5 inches, okay? Of course, material is going to vary depending on how dry it is and all that. This saw is just about, I'd say about 1/8 of an inch or so in cut depth beyond the depth of 2x material. So you are able to make those 45-degree cuts in a single cut instead of having to come back and make a second cut, which would be bad. If you got to cut something twice, it's 2x on a 45, I mean, you're going to have a hard time getting the angle right and getting the cut you want when you come through for that second cut. So it's pretty important, I think, when you're, for the saw. And like I said, it's why I ruled this out at first. I'm like, if I can't cut a 45 on 2x material, I mean, fully all the way through, and I'll have to make a second cut, that's just not something I want to deal with. I'd rather, just get the 7 1/4 inch saw. So that's one of the big benefits here. I don't know if it's a second iteration of the saw or a version that Milwaukee did where they raised this table up closer to the center of the blade. Maybe that's how they got a little bit more cut depth out of it. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure this is one of the few saws that can do that with a 6.5 inch blade. So, it's a pretty important thing for the saw to be able to do. But anyway, very lightweight saw. It's got the magnesium shoe and table. Now, let's see if I can illustrate here. One of the things I like to show is things that I noticed that a lot of folks I don't think typically talk about. But one thing I did note that's kind of a big difference between these saws is that the size of the shoe is a lot smaller on the 6.5 inch saw. If you can see that or not, if it's going to focus enough for us. But if you look, right here you see a massive difference in size right here between these two shoes. And that's something I didn't anticipate, but of course it makes the 6.5 inch saw lighter. We're looking at about, I'd say about 1 inch and almost nearly 1.5 inches is what I'm going to say. Nearly 1.5 inches difference there between these two shoes. So a lot less material, if you're trying to, that matters because if you're trying to keep the saw square, your cut square, a bigger shoe I think would help with that. So there's probably a little bit of a learning curve with this saw, and you'd have to be more aware of the fact that, and you get accustomed to it like any tool, that it's different than maybe what you're typically used to using. So, but there you have it, folks. What I think is the best circular saw on the market, again, for most people, not necessarily for everybody. I think this is a great, excellent way to go. I think it's also important to, especially with cordless tools, to make sure you match the blade with the saw. Now, Milwaukee makes an excellent blade, but I think Diablo is another way, or excellent way to go as well. Diablo has been proven on several tests to be really the sharpest blade out there. That's also, I guess, their carbide blade. That's also pretty inexpensive, really, when you compare it to other blades. But if you want to, on a cordless saw, you really want to make sure you're dealing with a sharp blade And if you can optimize that by getting something really good like Diablo, you're really going to get the best use out of the saw, and not have to carry maybe as many batteries or do as many battery changes, because you've optimized the saw's ability to cut through the wood, right? By having 24 teeth, a good Diablo blade, and decent sized battery on here. One thing with circular saws too I want to mention is there's some folks out there that say, oh, they just don't have the power of corded saws. It's 100% not true. And every time I've seen someone talk about that, they have a small, slim 2 amp hour battery on the saw, right? They'll have something like this battery right here, right? They'll put a slim battery on the saw, and they'll say, oh, it doesn't have the power. Let me demonstrate. It doesn't have the power of a corded saw. Well, of course not. You put a small battery on here that's not going to give you the same output. The bigger the battery you put on these cordless tools, the more power you're going to get. And that's the key thing to understand. And if you get, with Milwaukee, for example, if you use one of their high output batteries, you are definitely going to get more power out of the tool by design. I'm just going to grab one here to see if I can show an example. So here is an M18 high output battery. That means that all the cells in this battery are, instead of being 18650s, they're 21700s. So the battery, all the way around, the battery is bigger and has more power, and the saw adjusts to that. The electronics in the saw adjust that power of the battery, and you're going to get more out of the saw. So I just want to make mention of that when you hear folks say that cordless just doesn't have the power of corded, they're almost always running one of these slim, lighter batteries that are designed for a cordless drill or a shop light or something like that. So with that said, folks, that's all for today. Please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing, and we'll catch you on the next video.